Today we are going to talk a little bit about the new things that have been happening in Mexico in 2013 in terms of political economy and related matters. So what we will do is first talk a little bit about the background, and then we will get into what are the changes that have taken place, what are the things that we expect to happen in the future as a result of these political changes, and then if we have time we'll talk a little bit about the changes that have taken place in the past and what impact they have had. So that's sort of the general tone of my talk. As you can see, there's a URL address at the top which you can where this talk is also uploaded, so you can download it from there. This one, I don't know whether you can see it very well, but this actually gives you a picture of the US-Mexico border standing on the west end of Tijuana. So this side it's Tijuana, and that side it's San Diego. So you can see the contrast of how the population is distributed between the two countries, at least in some of the border areas. And that's not surprising. There are a lot of good political reasons why that is so. So as I said, this talk, I will start with talking about exports and imports, and in particular I'll talk a little bit about manufacturing in Mexico and how things have evolved over time, how things are evolving over time in the last decade or so. I'll talk a longer view about Mexico's GDP and economic growth, and relate that back to what are the factors why the Mexican economy has grown or has not grown in certain periods of the last 100 years. And then I'll talk a little bit about the reform that have taken place in 2013, the political changes, policy changes, and that has raised a lot of hope about Mexico's growth potential in the future. We'll see whether how feasible that is, and what role these manufacturing and so on will play in this whole thing. I will talk a little bit more about oil production, and we'll see in a second that oil production is a very important part of Mexican economic growth, has been in the past, less so in the immediate past. And then we will look at the kinds of changes that have taken place in the 1990s in Mexico and what impact they have had on the Mexican economic growth. So first of all, exports. Let's talk about exports in three different parts. If you think about exports from Mexico, it's not a simple picture that Mexico just exports one particular thing and nothing else. The big driver of export is of course oil, has been so for the last 80 years or so, and oil revenue produces a very substantial part of Mexico's export. In fact, 80% of crude exported from Mexico are exported to the United States. As a consequence, Mexico has a very important role to play in the US strategic interest about oil. The other part of the story is that Mexico does export a lot of crude oil, but then it imports back a whole bunch of gasoline, in the form of gasoline. Why? Mainly because Mexico does not have the capacity to refine oil. And that's one of the things that we'll talk a little bit more about, what the current policy changes can potentially do to that part of the story. The second part of the Mexican export story comes from tourism. Tourism is also a very important aspect of Mexican exports. In fact, a good part of Mexico's foreign currency is earned through tourism. And the third important part is remittance by Mexican workers who live abroad. Again, there the connection with the US is very, very important. Along with the tourism, more than half of the tourists that visit Mexico come from the United States. So again, US-Mexico border plays a very, very important role there. And the remittance, again, 90% of Mexicans living abroad live in the US, and therefore the remittance part of the story is also very important for the US and for Mexico from the US. As I mentioned earlier, these are the three things, but let's drill down a bit how big these things are for Mexico. Oil accounts for 10% of total exports in Mexico. That doesn't sound like much, but there are no other item that is as big as that. So in 2012, for example, Pemex produced $36 billion worth of crude oil and exported them mostly to the US. However, the other important part is that oil plays in Mexico's federal government budget. So right now, 30%, greater than 30% of the budget, depending on the price of oil, comes from oil, and remittance earns about $22 billion. So this is the second largest. Tourism, roughly about the same as the remittance from the Mexicans. In the last few years, remittance for Mexico from the Mexicans living abroad has been coming down slowly, whereas tourism earning is going up somewhat. Not a great deal, but somewhat. And to see how important oil is for the federal budget, it is now more than 30% of the federal budget. But if you go back 30 years, it used to be 90% of the federal budget. So in a sense, the importance of oil is still there, but it's not as important as it used to be 30, 40 years ago. Now, on the other hand, if we look at Mexican import, then half of it comes from the US. So again, US plays a very, very important role in this whole thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And nearly 20% comes from China today. This is only partial story because a lot of this import that comes from the US is not your import of garden variety kind of import, but it's import which are intra-industry. For example, Mexican manufacturing in many areas are very, very integrated with the US and to some extent with Canada. So, for example, a car is produced in Tennessee, the chassis is built in Canada, the seats are built in Mexico, and all of them were put together somewhere in one of these three countries. So, in that sense, the same car is being produced in three countries simultaneously. There has been some discussion about whether Mexico is immune to US recessions, particularly so in 2006, 2007. The then Finance Minister Agustin Carstens mentioned that any drop in GDP in the US is not going to impact Mexico at all. Mexico, as he said, was blindado. Of course, as we now today know, that's completely false, and it's in fact it's impossible to extract Mexico from the US process because, as we will see shortly, the manufacturing and industry in general are very integrated. So, how integrated are they? Well, here's a picture of industrial production of Mexico. The blue line there is the growth rate of industrial production in the US, and the yellow line is that of Mexico. As you can see, this is from 2004 onwards. Remember, NAFTA came into place in 1994. So 2004 onwards, things are moving pretty much in tandem. So when the US industry index fell 25%, Mexico's fell too, 15%, not as much, but nevertheless an important drop. So that tells us a story about how integrated US manufacturing is with Mexico's manufacturing. Alright, so this is for manufacturing in general. If we now look at industrial production, manufacturing production, you get a similar sort of picture. Again, growth in the US is coincidental with growth of manufacturing in Mexico for the reason that I explained with the car example. It's the same sort of stuff. You have an integrated production process, and not surprisingly, if you recall, a lot of Mexico's export go into the US. And if there's a recession in the US, obviously that's going to affect Mexican import and export. So let's switch back to the question about GDP process in Mexico. Here is a picture of Mexico's GDP over the last 110 years. So, what has happened to Mexico's GDP? Well, from 1900 to about the time after the revolution, things have been growing, but growing relatively a small amount. And then there was a period where it didn't grow at all. In fact, it fell. This is the time of the Great Depression. And before the Great Depression actually ended, Mexico started to take off. And from 1940 to around 1981 was what we nowadays call the golden age of economic growth in Mexico. And that's the time where the economy really took off. And you can see that in this graph. From this point onwards, the Mexican economy grew until 1981. However, in the 1980s, Mexican economy suffered a big setback. And that's also seen in this picture, that if you look at the economy in 1981, the GDP per capita, it's pretty much the same at the end of 1990. So between 1981 and around 1998, the economy has been completely stagnant, and that's why it's known as the lost decade in Mexico. Then it is growing, but not growing as much. It's growing just a bit.